this video, we're going to go over React. We're going to cover setting up a React project. We're going to go over understanding components, so class-based components, functional components, etc. We're going to go over JSX. What is it? Why do we need it? Why do we use it in React? How important is it? Why isn't it just like HTML? Kind of, but it's JSX. So it's like if HTML had a baby, it would be JSX. And then we're going to go over state, props, so state management, props, what best practices are for that. So to set up state in a manner that is conducive to a healthy environment. We're also going to go over handling events. We're going to cover conditional rendering. So rendering items based on conditional statements. So like if something's true, then do this. If else, then do this. So like if this is true, run this. If not, run this, right? We're going to go over mapping iterations, so like lists and keys, and then maybe some basic form stuff, React router, state management with Redux, and a whole lot more. So let's jump in. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you like it, subscribe, please. I have like 10 subscribers. Trying to get more subscribers. It'd be appreciated. You don't have to, though. I don't subscribe to a lot of people, so I get it, but if you want to, it helps. Thank you. Okay, so I'm in my terminal, and what we need to do first to install React is to run the npx script, the create-react-app script, which will then create our React project. So go into the folder of your choosing. I'm in this folder right here, and I'm going to pull this up so it's not transparent, so it looks better, so you don't see that in the background. All right, we're going to run npx create-react-app, and I'm going to name mine demo client React. You can name it whatever you like, and then you need the package, the npm package, create-react-app, or that dependency if you're not using the npm version. And so I'm going to type Y to proceed and install that, and then that's going to run and generate all of my build configurations, all of my boilerplate. It's going to generate basically the bare bones React project. And then what we'll do is we'll spin that up and we'll take a look at it, and we'll go into a little bit more history about React, but I'll keep it pretty brief. All right, so our project has been generated, and let's go ahead and clear this terminal out so it's more legible. And I'm going to spin this up. So I'm going to cd into my client React. Wait, what did I name it? cd demo client React. And then to run this, we need to run npm start. And that's going to spin up our client-side application. So what is React? React is basically a library/framework, more known as a library. That's probably the more technical description. But basically, it's a bunch of JavaScript, and it's modular based, right? So you can essentially import and export components, keeping them nice, clean, tidy, and also reusing them over and over again, depending on what you're using. So like, let me give you an example. If we have a button and we want to reuse this custom styled, custom designed button, then instead of doing it in every single page and application, what we can do is we can just import that button and reuse it and pass props to that button. And then we can have that as a dynamic modular based button. Now, what are props? Props are children or data given to the child element. What is a child element, you may be asking? So basically, if you have a element, and inside that JSX, for instance, you have a nested element, then that is a child element. It is the parent. This is the parent. This is the child, and it inherits the parental props that are passed down to the child component. And so that's one example of how, like, one of the benefits of React, I should say, is that you can reuse components in a modular fashion. And another big bonus is when you save, it loads live on the fly. So you don't have to keep like going up to the top of the tab bar, hit refresh, hit refresh, hit refresh. It'll just reload on its own. So if I copy this, let's open this folder up. So, oh, by the way, so you can see our app is running now. So that's the boilerplate. So if I do file, open folder, and I want to open that client demo React project. And so now we can take a quick glance at our folder structure. So we have the source folder. This is all of your stuff that is actually going to be rendered in the application. Anything that you want to use must go in the source directory. Now, typically what I do is I'll create a components subdirectory, nested directory, and then I'll create a pages. And then, so what I'll do is I'll basically, let me zoom this in. I think I can zoom this in. View, appearance, zoom in. There we go. Okay, so all my pages go here, and then all of my components go here. And so if I want to render a page, I'll just import all of the relevant components within this folder into my page file, and then into the browser router or the routing navigational file, right? So let me just show you an example on the live reload so we can see this right here. I'll just do a couple Ds afterwards to show reloads up on the fly. So that's pretty nifty. That's a great benefit of React. Saves a lot of time in development. And so React is a JavaScript library / framework. It's a bunch of compiled code. It was released by Facebook. One of the good things that Facebook has done out of the many hellacious things that they do, or the non-helpful stuff like the metaverse. Anyway, React was made by Facebook, and Facebook did an excellent job on this, maintaining it, making it open source, et cetera, et cetera. So kudos, Facebook. I don't like you, but I do like React. And so it's a JavaScript library. That's important to note that it is JavaScript based. So it's all JSX is basically HTML, but it's the JavaScript version for React. It's just a different syntax change, but it fundamentally operates in the same manner. So I think that's enough background history. Let's jump into some basic React stuff now. So we're going to go in our app.js file, and I'm going to show you some basic examples of JSX versus HTML. So let's see, for instance, I'll just keep this up as a reference actually. So in HTML, typically you would have a class or an ID, right? Whereas in JavaScript or React, you use class name. And then a lot of the other things are the same. You can see obviously this image is being imported at the top, and then it's being rendered through the source tag in the image. The image tag is principally the same as a HTML tag outside of the class name, but we're importing it in that modular type design or that modular way of doing things, as well as like for instance, if I wanted to import this app component into my index.js file, you can see the app, every component starts with a capital letter. You've got to remember that. Never name your components lowercase. So always camel case them. So see how the app right here is function app. Then we export our component so that we can actually import it in other components. So basically we create our project, we create our module, and then we export it. So in a file that's importing it, then right here, we actually import it and then we render it. Everything in a React project is rendered through this root render file. So as we can see, it's doing create root, and then it's doing document get element by ID root. And if we go into our client-side application, we can actually see that there is a root tag right here, and that root tag renders all of our index HTML, JavaScript, etc., etc. It renders everything through that root tag. So also I want to cover the public folder right here. The only things that you really need to pay attention to is the index.html file. So this is where it renders through that root tag that we just described. And then, so not a lot's going to go in here. You're going to import your link tags. So if you're using Font Awesome or something like that, you can import your dependencies here, as well as your script tags at the bottom here. But for now, we're not going to worry about the index.html. Also the title. So typically a HTML file will have a title which changes the name of your project, the tab header, right? So this right here. And so that's how you change that. Same principle. In your index.html file, all of the same rules apply to this. It's really only in the source directory and other, basically the source directory that the React/JavaScript magic occurs. So let's do this. Let's go over state now. Okay, so what is state? I'm going to change this function to ES6, ECMAScript 6, which is the latest, up-to-date, best way of doing things with JavaScript. Okay, we got that change. And so how do I create state? What is state? Why do we need state? There's probably a lot of questions you may have about state. So what is state? It's basically a way of storing values in a component's local environment. So it's only accessible through that component, not the parental classes or components outside of that component. Now, if you have a component nested in a component, and I'll show you that here in a sec, but if you have a component nested within another component, you can pass the state from the outer component into the child component and use that state via props in the child component. But it cannot go the reverse. It can't go up the hierarchy. It can go down the hierarchy. So let's create state, for instance. So say I have a timer, right? Let's do this. Let's change this to the current time is, and then I'll do state, timer. So what we want to do, and we'll cover lifecycle hooks here in a moment. So like use effect for functional components, and then we'll also go over class-based components. So component did mount, component did update, component will mount. Trying to think what others. There's 6 or 7 total, but they're basically lifecycle hooks. So like when something occurs in an application, do X, Y, Z. So like component did update. If a state change occurs, then the component did update because this update did occur in that component. It will then run that code of logic. But yeah, so let's create the state real quick. So const, and then I'm going to destructure state, and then I'm going to set state, and I'll explain this, don't worry. And then we'll do use state, and then I'll do timer equals 20. Okay. So what is this stuff doing? We also need to import, at the very top, we need to import React. In every file, you're going to want to import React, right? This is mandatory. It's required for React. And then what we're going to do is we're going to destructure. So we're going to pull off the use state. So this right here, this function from our React project. So what this does is basically it goes into the React dependency, and then it destructures or pulls apart React.useState. So we could technically do this React use state, but that's dirty. That's too much work. It's extra code. It's just not clean. It's not the best way of doing things. The best way to do things is to destructure and allocate appropriately via destructuring. You don't want to do React use state, React did blah blah blah, React did blah blah blah, whatever it is. You want to just destructure it once. So like fragment, right? If I have a fragment, which is basically like an empty div. If I have a fragment, I don't want to do React fragment and then do that throughout my application over and over and over and over and over again. It just doesn't make sense. It's repetitive. It breaks the principles of dry. Don't repeat yourself. So destructure. Always, always, always destructure. And so state, right? So we have this variable state, and it's only accessible in our app component. But what does this set state do? So how do we update this, right? So we have this timer variable value in our state item, and you can see right here we're targeting it as state.timer. So we're targeting this. So if I give this a save, for instance, it'll show 20. Decrement this. We're going to put a button and show the live dynamicness or the flexibility of React, I should say. And so let's go back to our text editor. And just follow along with this stuff. If you want to be hands-on, you can follow along. Otherwise, just watch the video. I guess depends on how you learn best. But so set state. Now we're gonna go over setting state. What is state? We've already covered a little bit of that. How do we update state? And so how do we update this timer count? We'll basically put a button. So I'm going to put a button down here, and then I'm going to do an on-click handler. And an on-click handler is basically an event handler. So when you click the button, it'll run this code. And what we'll do is I'll come back to that. And then we'll close off we'll just skip the class name or the class, and we'll just do a normal button, and I'll do click me to decrement. And so this is going to decrement our timer count, and this will show the dynamicness of React versus like index HTML files or just like raw index files. And so what we're going to do is we're going to do set state, and this is going to update our state. So this is how we update state, is we take the previous state. So if you're using, there's two ways to do this essentially. So you have the individual way, which is this way. I'll put a null value to this. So you have my item, update my item. So if we called this right here, if we called update my item, this would update this only this state item because we've assigned update my item to my item. So this updates this value. And so if I did like true, and when I click this button, it will update. I'll console log that to show you. My item, my item. And I'll explain why we're using this syntax, this format over this format in a moment, because it gets repetitive. It goes back against the principles of dry. Don't repeat yourself. Make things as simple as possible, both for yourself and other developers. So let's console log this. So we'll see null, and then it'll turn to true when we update that state item. So if I go here, and then I click this button, let's go to the console. So we can see my item is null, and then it dynamically changes to true on the fly. And it's still true, so it's not going to update. It's not going to console log that any longer. Cool. So, or like in one example is you could take the previous state, and then you could just swap it depending on what you're doing, right? So I could take the previous state, which is null, but we'll have to change that to false to make this work. And then I'll change it to true, false, true, false, true, false. I'll show you. So if I do this and I click it, we get a bunch of true, false, true, false, true, false, true, false. So that's why React is so awesome. It's very powerful. But why do you not want to use this way, this method, versus this method? Well, if we have numerous items in our state, like value 1, users, an array, already seen, false, ready, false. So if we have all these items, we would have to essentially create one of these for each of our state items, which is like super repetitive, very laborsome, so time consuming and cumbersome. And it's just not the right way to do things. If you want to be a programmer that your team enjoys, or that you write clear, concise, cohesive code, then you don't want to repeat yourself. This is just not the way to do things. So what I do, and I learned this from other programmers, but basically you put all of the state in one item, and we just have to call that one set state item to update any of our state items. So whether we want to update timer or value or users, we can update all those, and I'll show you that now. So if I do set state, prev state, because we want to take the previous state, so we want to take all of these items as they were before we updated them and destructure them. So make sure that we take all these values and keep them in the updated state, and only update the value that we want to actually update. So it'll change timer to 15, but it'll leave the rest of this the same as it was previously. So if we click that button, if we click that button, we see that the timer is 20. When we click that, it's 15, right? So, but if we let's check the existing state so I can show you what I'm talking about. So if we do state, let's give this a live reload. And then, so the state is false, false, 20, array 1. And then if we do this again, we can see false, false, 15, array 1. So it only changes that one state item. So it's the best way of doing things, in my opinion. I may be wrong, but I'm pretty sure this is the right way to do things. Or at least I prefer it. Maybe it's not the right way to do things, but yeah. So we're going to now move on to props and children, so child components. So what is that, right? Well, let's create a component in our components folder, and we'll do test.js, and we'll create a new React component. So I'll do import React from React, and then this will be a class-based component. So we're going to need to import or destructure component from our React dependency. So we're going to do class, in the camel case, always capital letters, test component extends component. And then we'll have a constructor, which will take props, and then super, which will take props as well. And I'll explain these, don't worry. Not yet, but I will explain these. And then our state, this state will be initialized as an empty object. And then we'll return, say, some JSX, h1 hello h1. However, oh, right. We need the render. So we need a render and then our return statement. So rendering, this is any of your console logs should go in this code chunk right here. And then whatever you want to return should go in the lower half of the render function. If you put something in here, like this is for like component did mount and things like this. But you're not, if you put a console log out here, you're not going to get it. These are like your function helpers. So if I do like, say I change this into a button and I do an on click and then my click, then that would be my click. And that's how I would handle that function. So console log my click. All right, so now that we have our component built, and say the state item is like users and empty array. And then we need to export this component. And the reason why I chose a class-based component is to show you what a class-based component looks like. You can use these components. They're essentially the same as a functional or basically a functional component, which is what we see here with the const app and the default. But it's just class-based. So like that's why we don't have to declare like const my click because it's class-based. So, and I just now realized I need to fix that. This my click. So it takes protocol inheritance. So we need to basically target the class. So this, and then the function within that class, my click. And then we would also need to bind this. So say I just had this. Well, I won't explain bind right now. Bind is not important. Just follow this syntax, because otherwise you would have to do something like this. You would have to do this my click equals, or wait, what was it? This my click bind this. I think something like that. I don't use the syntax, so I'm not super familiar with it. But something along the lines of that. Whereas I just typically will just add the ES6 fat arrow function to it, and then I don't have to bind, because same principle of dry, right? So then you would have tons of these bind statements for every one of your functions that are also existent in that function or that component. Sorry, and so it's best to just destructure at the function in order to not have to bind over and over and over again. All right, so let's import this component. We want to copy that component name. And then we're going to go up to the top of the app.js file and import the file name, so test component from, and then we're going to go half a directory into components and then into test.js. And then the way you import components is basically you do the backslash and then a component name and then the slash and then the other reverse slash. So just like that. And this will render our button hello on our index.html right there. So we have our decrement button or our hello button. And so what we want to do is, so now let's cover passing props to children. So say I want to update the decrement button, I want to decrement by 5 when clicking hello. But that doesn't do anything, obviously, because there's no logic to the myClick. It's just going to console log that myClick. And we don't have that state available in this component. So, what do? Well, what we do is we basically take the state and we pass it as props to our element. So what I'll do is I'll do state equals, well, we already have the state right here, so let's create a unique name for it. I'll do timer equals, and then I'll do state timer. So now if we go into our test component, we do console log this props. Make sure you do this because we're targeting the class. Then we will see that we have our timer available. Now how do we, so say we want to change our timer value in the hello button, right? It does not have the state in that button. It's just props. It's just props passed to this component. So how do we update that? Because the state is in our outer component. Well, what we can also do is we can pass set state as props, right? So I'll do update main state equals set state. And then whatever you name it as the first value, that's what you're going to be using in your nested component. So I'll do update main state, and then I'll do on click, in the on click handle, I do this props. You always have to do this props, because if we check that console log again, you can see it's called update main state. That function is the props name. And then we'll call that, and we'll do 10, right, as an example. And so what that's going to do is that's going to send 10 to, we need to take the previous state. So we're going to take the previous state as a value, as a parameter or argument, and then we're going to do the same thing as we did in the main component with the set state in this component. So we're going to do ... prev state to destructure the previous state, and then timer equals, say, 1. And then let's give this a try. So let me go back to my editor here, or my window. So if I do decrement, it's not going to decrement anymore, but remember we changed the hello to 1, and voila, changes it to 1. So that's how you update state through nested props and stuff like that. So passing props from app.js to test.js, we can then update the component that is on the outer layer from the child component. But just remember, we cannot pass this user's value or any of these values into the app.js because it is the child of the parent app.js. All right, so now we're going to look at the functional use effect. So unmounting, mounting, and then checking for updates and updating logic or state based on that update. So we're going to do that in the functional component, and then I'll show you the class-based component use case as well. So typically we'll do a use effect. Use effect is identical to, at least this way, is identical to component did mount in a class-based component. So I'm going to copy and delete that. So once this mounts, it'll run one time. Now, if we put, say, like state timer in here, then every time the state timer changes, this will also re-render that. So it's kind of like a component did update in a sense. And so the way this works is basically when our component first mounts, it'll run one time. So if we do console log ran, we'll see this one time. So if I pull this up and I reload the page, well, we see it 2 times because it mounted twice, but essentially one time, right? So it just runs when it mounts is my point. And so what we want to do is we want to say maybe update the state when we do this. So set state, prev state. It's going to concatenate the old state with the new state. And then say we want to update value to 2. We could theoretically just put a console log down here. However, that's not going to work because our state updates, but this doesn't catch the active update. And what we're going to do is we're going to do essentially, we'll just do it outside so it constantly renders upon any change. So if I save that and then we go back to our application and I reload this, we see we get value 2. So once that mounts, it will run that logic. Now, say we wanted to unmount with useEffect. What we would do to unmount would basically be to add a return at the end of the useEffect and then add a function. And then what we want to do is, like when it unmounts, right, it'll run this logic. So unmounted. So once it mounts, it runs this logic. If we wanted to unmount, once it unmounts, it'll run this logic. So we'll say set state, prev state to, and we'll set it back to 1. Let me copy that camel case. Okay. And so what would a useEffect look like in a component did mount, or a class-based component? So we have component did mount, and it does not take the fat arrow. Typically, it's not a function in that manner. It doesn't take the fat arrow and the equal sign here, so don't worry about that. Just do the parameter section and then the actual function itself. And then you also have component did update. So that's if a component updates, this will run. And then you have component will unmount. That's another lifecycle method. And that's basically for when a component unmounts, but it's prior to the unmount itself. Component did unmount, or did mount. Component, let's see. Those are the bulk, I think. That's as far as what I use. That's the bulk of it. But there's like 5 or 6 others, or 5 or 6 total. So like 4 or 5 that you'll use frequently. But these are the most common. So like basically upon an update, once it mounts, once it unmounts, right? So these are the most useful instances of that. So yeah, so now let's jump into, let's see here. Let's jump into routing. So let's create routes and then multiple pages that we can redirect to. So we need to first install React Router DOM. So close the terminal session and then npm I for install, shorthand, and then React Router and React Router DOM. And I'm going to type in legacy peer depends, and that's just because my environment needs me to. You won't need that likely, but if you do, just tack that on if you have any issues during the install. So now we'll need to create our pages. So in the pages folder, let's create 2 pages. So page 1, and I'm using camel case. Whatever naming convention you use, just make sure you stick to the same naming convention. So camel case, underscores, whatever you're using, just make sure it's consistent throughout the entire application. So I'm going to do page 2 with camel case. And then what we're going to do is we're going to create this file, index.js, and then another one inside of the index, the page 2, another index.js. And so what I'm going to do is I'm basically going to create a component. These are going to be page 1 and page 2. So I'm going to do fragment from React. And then we're going to create the function for the component name. So page 1 helper, or well, page 1 page. And then I'm going to pass the props. And then we're going to return a multi-line fragment. And then in that, I'm going to just do an h1 page 1. And then we're going to export that component so we can import it within our main navigational file. So I'll do page 1 page. And then what we're going to want to do is we're going to actually want to copy this and then paste this into the other index file. That way we can just use the same configuration and change the component name to page 2 versus page 1 to make that easy to, so we don't have to repeat ourselves. And then also, you may be wondering how CSS works. So before we do the React Router, I want to cover CSS just very briefly. An inline style would look like this, style with 2 brackets, and then color gray, or like maybe text decoration line, underline. And what that, so you want to use camel case as well within the styling, the inline styling for your React component. You can also just create an index CSS file or whatever you want to name it, and just use standard CSS. So if I did H5, H4, whatever, color blue. And then you would have to import that, though, in your component that you want to use it in. And so I'm going to import out one directory and then index CSS. Okay, now I'm going to get rid of that CSS because I don't want to overwrite that. But, so now working on React Router. So that's basically how the CSS works. It's very similar. It doesn't require too much effort or modifications. And so what we're going to want to do is basically import the React Router package that we just started, that we just installed. So I'm going to import, and then we're going to destructure browser router, and then we're also going to take off, I believe, route and link. Well, we don't need link, we just need route. And so what we're going to want to do is we're going to take this browser router, and inside, not outside, inside the app component, we're going to, or the app class, we're going to put this browser router, and then we're going to open and close that bracket. And then what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to put routes. These routes represent a page. So if I spin my project back up, I'm doing npm start, it represents essentially a page, right? So this is a page right here. This is a page, so on and so forth. So they're all pages. So going back to the text editor, so we want exact, and that's going to say match the exact path that we're defining. And then we're going to do path and then home. So just a slash. So whenever you load the application, this path will load. And then we're going to do component and then null for now. And then we're going to duplicate this and then import our components and then put them in the component class. Or the just component section. That's not a class. It's just the props. So, and then we're going to do, say, maybe login. Maybe we want a login screen, right? So now let's import these two pages, these two screens, into our app.js. So I'm going to do import page one page, and that automatically goes into the appropriate directory and imports that. And then we're just going to copy this and paste and then duplicate it for page 2. Okay? And so now we want to go in and put these into our components, into the props of our route. And then I'm going to do page 2. And now we should have two pages. So obviously page 1 has the H1, the page 1. Page 2 has the styled H2, or H1 with the page 2 and the text inline styles. So we should see something a little bit different for the login screen. But let's give this a shot. So route may not be used in the routes element or never directly. Okay, so we got to place it in routes. So we need to also import routes from React Router DOM. Now keep in mind, this is coming from React Router DOM, not React Router. So inside the browser router, we're going to put routes. And we're going to close that bracket and then take our routes and just paste them in there. And then if we give this a reload, we can see we don't have anything on here. Let's check for errors. No errors. Let's see. So nothing's rendering. Let's do some more debugging. We have the exact path component. It gave an error about... Let's see. So we're getting this error, matched leaf routes. I don't know what this error is, so I'm going to give this to Google. Oh, right, the syntax changed. Okay, so on the routes folder, or in the route itself, the index, the element component portion changed to element from component. And then the actual rendering is right there. So we need to change our syntax. So we're going to change the component to element, and then we're going to import these components like this. And so we're going to make them as if we imported them into the component, similarly to what we did earlier with our test component file. Let's give that a save and see if it loads. And there we go, page 1. Okay. And then if we go to login, so this is only rendering. I'm scrolling up and down. You can only see page 1. And if we go to login, it should have page 2, and that's got our inline styles as well. So that's how you do routing in React Router DOM with React.js. Sorry for the little sidetrack here. I just forgot the syntax. So this is basically, you can see in version 6, you cannot use the component anymore. It was replaced in favor of element. So just whatever version you're using of React Router DOM, make sure you use the appropriate syntax. And you can find that through the console log. It'll give you warnings and errors. I want to cover some just React syntax stuff now that we have our pages set up. So let's go into page 1. And say we have a state value, right? So say state equals set state, and then import the use state, state. And if you type enter or tab, it'll automatically complete that for you, at least with Visual Studio Code. And say we have an array called data, and it's got objects in it. And it's got a key 1, value 1. And we're going to duplicate this a couple times. I'm going to show you how to map over items and iterate over an array and render that JSX. So we'll do 2, 3, 4, and 5. So this is more on the dynamic side of things, but it's helpful. So say we want to iterate over this array, data. So what I could do is I'm going to get rid of this page 1. And this is on page 1. And I'm going to do the curly brackets. So this is how you do inject JavaScript into the JSX. You do the curly brackets, these guys. And so I'm going to do type of state data does not equal undefined. So what I'm doing is I'm basically checking if it exists and checking the length and seeing if it's over 0. And then if it is, then we want to map or iterate over this array. So map and then item index and then open brackets and then add the ending. And this is a conditional statement. So this is a conditional map. So what we're doing is we're checking to see if it exists. If not, just render null, so render nothing. And then iterate over that array. Let me turn the word wrap on so it's easier to see. Okay, so and then now in this is just returning, this is just rendering this data. So we need to return the data. So return, open brackets, and then a multi-line expression, and then fragment, and then close the fragment, which is like an empty div essentially. Don't worry about what a fragment is. It's just a placeholder essentially. And then we want to do maybe like an li with maybe the class name of, then this is what we're going to do. So we're going to do item key and then close that and then open curly brackets, close curly brackets, item value. So what we're doing is we're taking this item right here and then we're mapping over each one of these items. And we're extracting the key and the value, the key and the value, or I'll label these as label value. So that makes it a little bit more easier to understand. So we have the key and the value, and then we also need to do key index, and that way, so what the key does when you're mapping or iterating over items in React is basically it keeps track of which items have been rendered. So if this key changes, that item will re-render. So you don't want to use like a UUID or anything like that because those can change dynamically on the fly if they're not coming from the backend or the database. And then you'll have a bunch of re-renders and unnecessary renders. So you only want to make sure that you have a relatively unique yet fixed index. So that's why typically I just use the index. So the only time this chunk will reload is if the length of the data changes. So say I do I have an API call and it updates this data, and it updates this data, then it'll re-render it, but only then, right? And so let's give this a save and see what it looks like. And so if I go back to we can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's how you iterate over items and inject JavaScript into JSX. And so make sure the open brackets, do not use the parentheses, use the brackets. I also want to cover a pretty awesome thing called NPM or Node Package Manager. NPM packages are basically external code or modular based components that you can import into your React project to expedite development, increase your workflow, and to basically just be more productive and not build stuff that's redundant that you could just import otherwise. Let me give you an example. So if we wanted a image carousel React, I can search for this, and then there's a whole laundry list of different packages that people have released. What you want to do is you want to check the age of the package, as well as go into the package itself, the URL, and then check out what it looks like. So this is like an image slider / gallery. We'll actually use this component in our example. But you want to check the weekly downloads. So this has about 200,000 downloads per week, or 150. And then you can also check the GitHub as well if you want more documentation. Sometimes on the NPM module, they won't include as detailed documentation as this person has. Sometimes it's on the GitHub, so always check that if there's no documentation or documentation is lacking in the NPM package. But yeah, so how do you use this? We need to copy the NPM install script, which is in the top right. You can also see the code itself, what you're using or what this package uses. Dependencies, dependents, and versions. Versions are important, code's important, and the README. README is the most important thing, and it'll start on that when you click it. So go into the README and then click the install on the top right, and we're going to close this terminal out and install this package by just pasting. Now that our package is installed, let's spin back up the client-side application, so npm start. And there's multiple scripts like npm build, npm start, npm run test, etc. Those are all just for different, like if you want to test, you would run npm run test. If you're using like test, jest or enzyme and things like that. Or if you just want to start the application, npm start. If you want to build it for a production environment, npm run build. So, and you can configure each one of those however you'd like as your development proceeds and continues. So moving on, we're going to import this package. I'll show you how to do that. So basically, this is used through this tag right here. So I'm going to copy this and paste that import script. And then this is called React-image-gallery. If you go to the NPM website, you can find it through this package name. And then I'm just going to take the existing example and take that data. So it's just simple for demonstration purposes. And then we're going to take the image gallery and then we're going to return that. So in our right under our list of items that we're iterating over, I'm going to paste that, give that a save, and reload that. And here's our slider. So now we don't have the CSS and whatnot, which is right. So if you wanted to import with Webpack, you could use the style import. However, we don't have Webpack working. So I'm going to go and see if there's any other examples that we can look at. Maybe there's a link that we can just include in the index.html file. So let's see, app.js. There's no CSS here. Let's check the example folder. Index.html. And there is the image gallery CSS, but let me ChatGPT this. When in doubt, ChatGPT. It's like Stack Overflow, but better. What is the CSS script for this NPM package? Let's see here, and there we go. So I'm just going to copy this, and if you want to use the Webpack version, you can. Webpack is basically a bundler or a compiler for React, but I'm not going to. I'm going to try this tag first that ChatGPT just gave me, and it's probably going to fail, and it works. Okay, cool. Lo and behold, it works. And so basically, here's our image slider. So you can see very little work in order to get such an impact or such a awesome, result. Like we now have a full page image slider that also goes full screen if we want to. And that was all through just importing this one awesome badass package. So yeah, NPM is a godsend. You'll want to use this in your projects. I'll show you another example. Like if I wanted a picker for React Native. React Native is like React, it's just the mobile version. But for example purposes, I'll show you. So like this is a picker for React Native. That would be a pain in the butt to make normally. It would take time. I mean, it's doable. It's definitely doable, but it takes time. And you want to reduce the workload on yourself. So NPM packages are phenomenal. Alright guys, that was the video for today. That's a breakdown of React, state management, lifecycle hooks, best practices, class-based components, functional components, and whatever else we covered, some fundamental React stuff. And so if you enjoyed this type of video, please subscribe. It's appreciated. I would greatly appreciate that. I'm trying to build my following or my audience here on YouTube, and I'm not getting a lot of views on my videos until I have subscribers. So if you help on that mission, I appreciate you so much. If not, I also still appreciate you. I hope you have a wonderful day and stay tuned for more updates.